Reeds. I've already said a lot about them, and we all know that they're a big deal for double reed players. So here's what I know about double reeds, and it's pretty helpful to get by with a lot of situations. I'm going to show you a little bit about reeds in general and how to figure out what might be wrong with them. And then we're going to learn how to adjust the wires on a bassoon reed. And finally, we'll talk a little bit about how to adjust the cane by shaving a little bit of cane here and there on the reed. So we'll do that one at a time, but the first thing obviously is to understand some stuff about reeds in the first place. So the typical German-style bassoon reed is the norm these days. The other style you might hear about is a French bassoon reed, and that's a different thing. Don't purchase a French bassoon reed for your player. But the basic hallmark of a German reed is that it has, and if you're familiar with any other kind of reed, it has a heart to it, which means it's thicker in the center, up the middle of the blade, and then it's a little bit thinner over the top. So you're going to see that in just a moment, but that's the basic difference. The French reed is thicker sort of all around and has kind of a consistent thickness throughout the blade, and sounds quite a bit different. There's actually a video in the More Videos section comparing the German sound to the French sound, and the French style reeds, and even there's a French style bassoon, they sound almost like a saxophone. It's not the bassoon that we're used to hearing, and it's not generally the bassoon that we hear in the US. So stick to German style reeds. If you're just buying something that says bassoon reeds, you can be pretty certain that you're going to get, unless it's a French company, you're going to get a basic German reed. So another thing to know in general about reeds is that you don't move from soft to medium to hard, just like, you know, clarinet players maybe start on a 2.5 and move up in the hardness as they move on in their years of playing. Generally, you need to start with at least a medium soft or medium reed with the bassoon, and that becomes even more important if you learn how to make some adjustments in the cane. So I buy medium reeds because I plan to at some point make some adjustments by shaving off a little bit of the cane. And if it's already medium soft and I take off some of that cane, now we're moving into the soft reed territory. So don't buy too soft reeds for your student. Medium soft if you want to be safe and make sure that it's going to be playable. But that's the basic idea for reed hardness. So don't have a beginner play on a reed that's way too soft just because they're new. It can actually make pitch and response be a bigger problem than it needs to be. So reed making then is sort of the big solution for bassoon players and professional bassoonists. But between all of the work that you do already for your students, chances are low that you have the time to actually make reeds all the time. So aside from that student having a private teacher who's going to make reeds for them, or the student themselves learning how to make reeds, which is kind of a long process, you can certainly buy handmade reeds online, and there's a few sources listed below for places you might be able to buy a handmade reed. But if you've purchased just a store-bought reed or ordered from somewhere like Amazon or a big company like Jones, then there's a good chance that the reed will play, but that it could use some adjusting. Okay? So reed adjusting is something that's really practical and really useful because you don't have to know the whole process of actually making the reed from scratch. All you need to know is some things about how to assess the reed and figure out what's wrong with it, and then some solutions for that. And that's what we're going to work through in this segment. So, starting with assessing bassoon reeds, we need to first decide what's wrong with the reed before we do anything and get out any knives or anything like that. We need to make sure we know what's wrong with the reed. So, before we can talk about assessing the different portions of the reed, we need to know what all those different parts of the reed are called. So let's check it out. Okay, so right here I have a general everyday bassoon reed. And there's some pieces and parts you should be familiar with before we worry about anything about actually adjusting our reeds. So some of them we learned earlier, like the back half of the reed, circular half here, is called the tube. And all of the reed portion up here that's shaved and flatter, that's called the lay of the reed. Then we have what's called the heart. And you can kind of see that here. You can see that it's a little bit thicker here in the center. And in a moment, we're going to hold it up to a light, and you'll see a lot more what I'm talking about when I say that the reed has a heart. Then we have, of course, the tip, generally the front of the reed, and the tip opening, which is a big deal. That's one of the things we're going to look at when we're assessing a reed. What is the shape of the tip opening? Then we have back here, next to the first wire, we have the collar, which is this part here that still has the bark of the cane before we get to the shaved portion. The collar here is just above the first wire. And we have the spine, which is an especially thick portion on the back of the reed here, and it's in the center. And again, you'll see how dark that is when we hold it up to a light, but it's significantly stronger there, and that's where a lot of the strength of a medium reed or a medium soft reed is coming from. So that's going to be thicker on a harder reed, that spine right there. Then we have the channels. The channels run down either side of the spine, so you can see the whole thing tapers toward the front as the reed is flattening out. And the channels are considered this inner space next to the spine on either side of the spine. Basically the space between the spine and the edges. So we've got channels running down either side of the spine. And then we call the sides that I just referred to, the sides are referred to as the rails. So the thickness is pretty visible on the side here, and those are called the rails. And on a really good reed, the thickness of those rails not only tapers from thickest here at the back to thinner here at the front, but it's equal all the way down. So you can look at the thickness of those two reeds that are attached to each other and just see if they look the same. Do they have the same tapered shape, and do they have that taper at all? Okay? So those are the rails on the side. And then, like we talked about before, we have the first wire, the second wire, and there's a third wire which is under this wrapped thread right here. And it's basically just holding the tube in place back here. The first two wires up here are the ones we can use to actually adjust the reed. So those are the pieces and parts that you should be aware of. And you might want to back up if you didn't catch any of those terms, because as we go on, I'll be using some of those terms to talk about adjusting the reeds. So, if we want to actually start to figure out whether this reed is any good, we need to start, first of all, looking at some of the obvious visual aspects of it, places where we can check whether it's in good shape just by looking at it. So the first thing I need to do anytime I'm going to assess a reed is soak it. So I've got a cup here with a couple of the reeds we're going to be looking at, and they need to be soaked. A reed that is not soaked is missing all that water inside, and it's going to be less translucent. So it's going to actually not do us any good to hold the reed up to a light. And that's the first thing we're going to do to assess our reed. I love doing this because it shows me whether I'm going to be able to fix the reed or not. So this step for me is always the first step to just see how good a reed is in the first place. Okay, so here's this reed again. And I'm going to adjust the light for a moment so that we can look through to the inside and see what's going on. So here's our reed, and if I hold just a little bit of a light up to the back of it, you can start to see that the corners at the tip are a little bit, there we go. The corners of the tip are quite a bit brighter. And if the reed's been shaved and shaped and balanced correctly, there's kind of an arc to that dark spot in the middle. So that curvature at the top, that arc, That's generally what we're talking about when we talk about the heart of the reed. Now, where it gets really dark there down the center, that's the spine. That's that much thicker portion that's giving the reed a lot of strength. But the heart is it's almost like a thumbprint, okay? And that becomes useful later, but the heart is like the taper at the tip of a finger. It's a nice curve, and it clearly leaves corners and a tip that's brighter and therefore thinner than the rest of the reed. Okay? So, holding the reed up to the light gives us a good sense of what's going on there. This one is shaped basically the way we would want. This looks like we want it to look, but I just opened up a new reed. And so, this is a medium reed, and I want to show you just out of the box. This is one I ordered online from Jones, which is just a large factory manufacturer. And you can see the shape is not quite as consistently rounded at the top. I definitely do have a lighter tip, and I can see that the thicker part of the reed down below the tip is extending further up than it really should. I need more of an arc here to get a properly balanced reed, so we're going to mess with that more later. But that's the basic idea. You can look at it from both sides, and what you're actually looking at is the reed that you're looking at. In other words, the reed that you can see is the one that you're evaluating when you look through the light. Even though technically that light is passing through both reeds, you can be assured that the shape that you're seeing is for the reed that you're looking at. And when you turn it around again, it's the same thing. So that's holding your reed up to the light and looking for that nice curvature at the top of the heart where we have obvious corners and a lighter tip. Okay, now remember that we had this reed earlier and we checked out the sides, which are called the rails. And we were looking at those, and not only do they need to be balanced in the same shape as they look from the side, but they also need to be lined up and flush to one another. So if I run along the side here, I want them to feel like they are equal and next to each other. Okay, and if they were to shift, so if these two reeds were to shift in the wires, then it would be what we call a slipped reed. And I have an example of one of those right here. So you can see on this guy, if we look closely, you can see actually the back reed from this side. You can see that those reeds are no longer touching end to end down the rails. From the side, it's maybe not quite as obvious. But when you look from the top, you can see, whoa, those two reeds are not lined up anymore. So that reed has slipped, and that's going to take some serious adjusting of the wires, or that reed just may be no good. It may, for all the adjusting that you do to it, it may never actually sit, depending on the shape of the underside of those reeds where they're touching together. It may just not be a good reed, so you may not be able to use it if it slips all the time. A bassoon reed can actually slip in the middle of playing or between uses. So make sure a bassoon player understands, or at least if they don't understand, that they're bringing you their reeds to assess on a regular basis, because reeds change all the time. Now, again, we want to check these wires, and in this case, our first and second wire are an appropriate distance apart. It's about 1/4 of an inch or less, but on a brand new reed, or if a reed is really old or sat on the shelf in the music store for a long time, the first wire can drop down onto the second wire. So if they're touching together, the top wire would be loose, and then you would just pull that wire up onto its groove before soaking that reed for the very first time. But you want to check that both wires are spaced out, and that first wire should be down a few millimeters from the collar right before the lay starts. We want to make sure that that reed is that wire is not all the way up on the collar. It's down a little bit, and that's okay. So we need to check those wires, and we need to check that the tube is round. So it looks pretty round, and the best way to test it is to just put it right on the vocal. Now, this really doesn't go on very far. The vocal tip is designed to take some pressure straight on. So don't worry too much as you're trying to push a reed on. Remember that it doesn't go on that far and that the buckle is designed to handle that. What the buckle's not designed to handle well is pinching or gripping or bending of any kind. So we just need to be careful about those forces when handling or putting a reed on the buckle. Okay, but if it goes on the buckle snugly and it doesn't wiggle, so it's not wiggling and has freedom this way, then it's fitting on fairly well. If it doesn't go on it doesn't go on about 8 millimeters, then we might have a tube that's too small for our buckle. In that case, you'd need to use a reamer to make the tube opening a little bit larger. Okay, so the tip opening is one thing we're going to definitely want to assess when we're checking out our bassoon reeds. This one is actually a pretty acceptable tip opening shape. It's fairly slender, and that's a good thing. If you end up with something that's way open, kind of looks like a football in there, I don't want to push this too much so I don't crack it, but if you end up with a big opening here in the front, often brand new reeds are way too open, then you're going to need to do some adjusting, probably on the wires here, to close that tip down. I'm going to grab one of my really well-soaked reeds because there's something else you can check when you look at the tip opening. So, when you squeeze the two sides of a double reed together, then you can see that tip closing. And I'm going to squeeze back here kind of close to the spine and only move up as close as I need to get it to shut. And what I'm looking for here is that the hole closes with the center closing last. So if it all closes at once, then I actually have, the cane is actually a little bit too weak in the middle. The places that close last are the strongest pieces of the cane. So if I close it down and I notice that this side or that side still has kind of an opening, that side or that side is thicker. Whichever side is staying open is thicker or stronger cane. In this case, though, I have about what I'm looking for, what I want, which is that the center is closing just a little bit later than the rest of the reed. That means that the center of my reed is a little stronger than the outsides, and that's what I want. So that's another way to check looking at the tip opening. There are some diagrams for the shapes of good tip openings versus bad tip openings that you can check out in the workbook or on this page. Finally, the obvious audible way to assess the reed is to crow. So this is the new reed that I just opened today, and it hasn't been worked on very much yet. I'm going to try to make sure that I have a nice full exhale and that I have my embouchure formed the best that I can with my top lip touching the first wire, a little bit beyond my bottom lip. So I'm going to see what happens on the crow. So I got a decent crow right off the bat, and as I strengthened the air or as I got into my full steady airstream, I only heard the higher sounds on the reed. And this is typical of a reed that's a little bit too stiff or a reed that has a little bit too small of a tip opening. Now we looked at this earlier, and the tip opening looks pretty good for a new reed. So this means it's a little bit stiff, and that's what we saw when we held this reed up to the light, is it was actually a little bit thicker than it should be further up the reed. So in order to free up the low frequencies, we're going to need to either open the tip a little bit, which is something we can do with wire adjustments, or we're going to probably need to take a little bit of the cane off to soften the reed in the appropriate places. That way we can get the low sounds mixed in with the high sounds and get a good crow on our reed. So, one thing you should know about the crow is that you can try a reed both ways, and sometimes one of those sides works a lot better for the student than the other side. So if you're testing a student's reed, if you're testing your own reed, or if you're having a student test their own reed, try it both ways. Sometimes one side works significantly better than the other side. Just don't forget to have your reeds soaked up before you do any adjusting. So next up, we're going to talk about the two ways we can adjust bassoon reeds. We can either adjust the wires, or we can actually adjust the cane by removing some of it in the appropriate places. That's up next.